Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 487. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone, today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how's it going?
Pretty well. How are you doing, Kyle?
Pretty good, Connor. We got a lot to talk about in today's show, so just want to remind people to share the show. Hosted at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show, and of course it's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcast. Follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. And then if you follow myself or Connor, anywhere we're on social media, we always put all of our content, including the shows and the articles we write out there, most of which we talk about on the show. So I kind of got a few things to talk about here, Connor. And the general gist of what I want to highlight on today's show was this absolutely insane Biden administration plan where they're talking about funding a world war. This is really wild. The Biden administration pitches American on funding wars in Gaza and Ukraine. And so the president is preparing to ask Congress for $100 billion for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and border security. So President Biden on Thursday night delivered an address from the Oval Office, making his case for the U.S. to continue funding the proxy war in Ukraine and Israel's onslaught in Gaza. Biden said he will ask Congress on Friday to authorize more spending for that Ukraine war and the unprecedented military aid for Israel, which we already give Israel $4 billion in military aid a year. It's already a wealthy country with an advanced military, so why in the world will we have to give you Israel a bunch of aid to take care of the people of Gaza, who of course Israel already has a stranglehold on? Is kind of nonsensical. But Connor, my guess is a significant amount of aid for Israel here is something that is going to entice a lot of Republicans to vote for it, even though they've said they won't vote for the Ukraine aid. So as of when Dave DeCamp wrote this article last night, it was going to be $100 billion. I think this morning I saw the AP reported that it was now looking at $105 billion. The breakdown of what we know so far is roughly $60 billion for Ukraine and $10 billion for Israel. So that leaves an awful lot of money to go towards Taiwan and the border. I guess, at least 10 billion would be my guess will be going towards the border, Connor, but that leaves 25 billion roughly for Taiwan. So this is, a major provocation, not just, with Russia in the Middle East and in Taiwan and with China, but we also have this pending conflict with North Korea, something that I've been writing about at the Institute, but I will talk about that next week just because we got so much stuff going on here. I think Connor, in his segment, is going to kind of talk about the wider war that could be flaring up in the Middle East. We've had incidents with the Houthis, with the Shia militias in Syria, and also in Iraq. The Iraq stuff we did cover on Wednesday's show. I had written about it at the Institute, but we have some more updates on it since then. So, let's look at this, what Congress is saying. So I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute. Congressional report calls for U.S. to build up nuclear program to fight two-front war with Russia and China. So a congressional report on nuclear policy warned that Russia and China pose existential threats to the United States, and action must be taken now to prepare for conflicts with the two superpowers. The commission called for Washington to prepare to fight simultaneous wars with Moscow in Europe and Beijing in Asia. And Connor, this, of course, they weren't talking about what was going on in the Middle East in this report, but now we're already at war, probably across the Middle East for some time to come as well. The final report of the Congressional Commission on Strategic Posture of the United States is meant to give Capitol Hill influence over nuclear policy. The executive summary urged immediate action to respond to the existential threats. And so one thing that William Hartung, I believe, wrote the article that the Quincy Institute ran on this. And he points out that, sometimes these Congressional Commission reports, completely fall away. Nobody ever pays attention to them. Other times they get to dictate policy. My worry, Connor, is that this is going to be one of the times that it dictates policy, because it's going to give the Hawks in Congress ammunition to fight for more military spending. At the same time, like Harton says, I really hope this is one that gets thrown in the wastebasket and never gets talked about. So the executive summary of the report says the U.S. faces strategic challenges requiring urgent action. Given current threat trajectories, our nation will soon encounter a fundamentally different global setting than it had experienced, where we will face a world where two nations pose nuclear arsenals on par with our own, which isn't true, but that's what they say. The report goes on to say, in addition, the risk of conflict with these two nuclear peers is increasing, is an existential challenge for which the U.S. is ill prepared unless its leaders make decisions now to adjust the U.S. strategic posture. And then I note here that the U.S. and Russia hold about 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, which are divided roughly evenly between Moscow and Washington. Several Cold War era agreements limited the White House and the Kremlin's strategic weapons. However, over the past 2 decades, Washington withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Meanwhile, the last remaining agreement, the New START Treaty, is on life support. And meanwhile, China's strategic arsenal is significantly smaller than that of Russia or the United States. Additionally, Washington's relationships with Moscow and Beijing are near historic low points. The U.S. has engaged in massive military buildups in Eastern Europe and in East Asia, angering Russia and China. Under the Donald Trump and Joe Biden administrations, the U.S. has significantly stepped up its military support for Ukraine and Taiwan. Moscow and Beijing view those policies as threatening their national security. The Congressional report concluded that war between the U.S. and Russia and or China is becoming more likely, and Washington should respond by building up its conventional and nuclear weapons. The report says, we arrive at these conclusions following a comprehensive year-long review of the threats America faces, as well as its strategy and planned capabilities to address those threats. The evidence demonstrates that the U.S.-led international world order and the values it upholds are at risk from the Chinese and Russian authoritarian regimes. The risk of military conflict with those two major powers has grown and carries the potential for nuclear war. Therefore, the Commission reached a unanimous nonpartisan conclusion that today's strategic nuclear outlook requires an urgent national focus and series of concerted actions not currently planned. Those challenges drive necessary adjustments to the force posture of the United States nuclear capabilities, its size and composition. A full spectrum of non-nuclear capabilities is also essential to the nation's strategic posture. So, Connor, they're saying that our military is completely inefficient to the problems that we face, even though Congress has already authorized a $1.5 trillion plan to upgrade the U.S. nuclear weapons platforms, and has passed year over year record-breaking defense budgets that really total about $1 trillion. So, even with all that, apparently Congress thinks it's not enough money. And, it says here that the objective is to fight a multi-continent war. The objectives of U.S. strategy must include effective deterrence and defeat of simultaneous Russian and Chinese aggression in Europe and Asia using conventional forces. And so this is absolute lunacy, Connor. The idea that America would have to completely control Europe and Asia and must have at all times the military capabilities to do that. And I'm sure if you actually ask the Pentagon and Congress and the White House, they also want to have the ability to fight, Israel's enemies in the Middle East. So that would be Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Iran, as well as North Korea. So how this would be a sustainable financial thing to do over the long term makes absolutely no sense to me. And yet, the Hawks have complete control over the narrative and the budget. So this is what's going to happen. Um, I wrap up this article here. The Congressional Commission said Washington must be prepared to fight a nuclear war against Beijing and Moscow if the two-front war cannot be won by conventional weapons. The U.S. and its allies and partners do not feel sufficient conventional forces to achieve this objective. The U.S. strategy would need to be altered to increase reliance on our nuclear weapons to deter or counter opportunistic or collaborative aggression in the other theater. And so they say we need to be quicker on the nuclear button so we could fight a nuclear war with Russia and China at the same time. Again, kind of complete insanity. And so, that's Biden's kind of talking about fighting a two-front war. The Congressional report is talking about fighting a different two-front war, which, equals three wars, which is what we're seeing here. So Pentagon officials say the U.S. is ready to fight a war with China while supporting Israel and Ukraine. The Defense Department, I wrote this for the Institute yesterday, by the way. The Defense Department officials said U.S. military assets in East Asia are sufficient to confront China as the Pentagon supplies the Israeli and Ukrainian armies with weapons. One official described the 2023 as a banner year for Washington, increasing its military presence in the region surrounding China. On Tuesday, the Pentagon held a press conference to discuss 180 unsafe, unprofessional, coercive, and risky encounters between Chinese and American aircraft over the past 2 years. However, reporters asked the officials, and this was Commander of Indo-Pacific Command, so that's Indo-PACOM, Admiral John C. Aquilano, and Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Strategy, Security Affairs, and that is Dr. Eli Ratner, who we have talked about quite a bit on this show. And the reporters steered the conversation with these two officials towards the Pentagon's ability to deter China as it arms Israel and Ukraine. The admiral said that Indo-PACOM has not seen any reduction in its military assets available in the region, and the U.S. was ready to win a war with China. What I will tell you is this. I haven't had one piece of military equipment or force structure depart. The U.S. is a global power, and that means we can deliver, effect, and execute our deterrence responsibilities across the globe. But I don't think any other nation can do this at this time, but the U.S. can. Indo-PACOM prepares every day to ensure that we execute both of the missions he's talking about the Secretary of Defense gave me. Number one is to prevent conflict in the Indo-Pacific, and number two, if mission one fails, is to be prepared to fight and win. And of course, he's talking about their fighting a war against China. So Ratner explained that he wasn't concerned about Chinese aggression because the White House has had a banner year in building up its military alliances in the Asia Pacific. He said, "We have been developing a more mobile, distributed, lethal, and resilient force posture in the Indo-Pacific. We've had a banner year for that in regards to over the past 12 months. A lot of great work in concert with Indo-PACOM from Japan, the Philippines, down through Australia. And in the meantime, we have been developing our alliances and partnerships in the region, and to a T, our key alliances and partnerships in the region are stronger than they ever have been." And so, they talk a little bit more about these 180 encounters that they say have happened over the past 2 years. And they can't even really define it to the reporters exactly what this means to have a risky, coercive, unprofessional, or unsafe encounter. In the past, the Pentagon has used the labels unsafe and unprofessional, and typically these were, referred to things that would involve American aircraft or ships either taking drastic action, and that would mean unsafe, or violating what the U.S. would claim are the established rules in international airspace and international waters, where China would argue that these aren't international airspace and international waters, so different rules should apply, but those would be unprofessional encounters. Adding the coercive and risky is probably watering down those two definitions so they could increase the number of encounters that they say China is acting inappropriately in. So, and again, one very important other thing to mention here, Connor, is of course that the Pentagon doesn't talk about where these encounters happened when it's very likely they all happened in or above the waters claimed by China in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. This isn't going off happening off the coast of Alaska or California or around the island of Hawaii. It's happening around territory that China claims. And, the U.S. is all the way up to China's border, not the other way around. So we also have here our Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, saying on Monday that the U.S. could certainly afford to fund the war in Ukraine and Israel's onslaught in Gaza at the same time. Of course, there are some problems with this, Connor, where even if you could print an unlimited number of dollars, eventually you might start running out of ammunition. And we do have this here today from DaveDeCampeAntiwar.com. U.S. to send Israel artillery shells initially bound for Ukraine. And so it's a little bit of a head scratcher here, Connor, as to why we would possibly, or, how we would possibly be able to fight both of these wars when one of the very key things that Ukraine needs, we're now taking from Ukraine to send to Israel. I guess if they could make 155 millimeter shells out of $100 bills, then maybe they could unlimited fund this war. But you can't do that. You need actual raw materials, and you need to be able to produce it, and that is not happening. All right, so I got a couple things here before I hand the show over to Connor that I just kind of want to run through really quickly. Putin went to China and spoke with Xi, and this has just another development in the ties between Beijing and Moscow. This was for the Belt and Road Forum. I think there was representatives from like 130 countries there. And in the run up to this meeting, both leaders talked a lot about, this emerging multipolar world. And one interesting place that you're going to, start to maybe see some issues between Russia, China, and the U.S. is over the Israel issue, where there is, China, I think the foreign minister said that, Israel's claim to need self-defense has far elapsed from what they're doing in Gaza, right? Like, this is clearly just the collective punishment of civilians. And so, and we've also seen soaring trade between Russia and China. So that's important. We also have the U.S. secretly providing Ukraine with cluster ATACMS. We have CNN reporting on Tuesday that the U.S. secretly provided Ukraine with Army tactical missile systems. Those are ATACMS, munitions that typically have a range of about 190 miles and can be fired from HIMARS. U.S. officials told the New York Times that the ATACMS and the U.S. has provided Ukraine are armed with cluster bombs. And so I know Connor has covered this on the show in the past. I guess, where it happened covertly was, they didn't announce like they usually do. The Abrams tanks are arriving in Ukraine in 1 month, Connor. They're going to be there in 1 week. And then 2 weeks later, they finally arrived. And so, the Russians have a pretty big heads up on when these systems typically enter. But this time, the Ukraine carried out attacks with them before the West officially announced they were there. So, two more things I want to mention really quick, and these are about Biden's trip to Israel. I believe on the last show I did kind of go over what Biden said there, kind of his gaffes, and how it didn't seem to be a particularly sharp moment for our aging president. So actually having an articulated policy from that was kind of difficult. I know one of the big things the Biden administration tried to promote was this idea that what we're going to have is we're going to give Israel military aid, and then we're going to push Israel to allow some humanitarian aid into Gaza. Of course, for the situation in Gaza, humanitarian aid isn't even really a band-aid at this point. There needs to be real changes to what's happening in the region to make that place at all livable for the people that live there. And so Not to say that allowing in some aid won't save some lives, not saying that the U.S. sending $100 million in aid to Gaza won't be somewhat helpful. But, if you're also shipping Israel $10 billion in weapons, then you're going to see a lot more destruction to the Gaza Strip than at all help in aid you're giving. And so, the U.S. There's a report that Biden gave Netanyahu private backing for the Gaza ground invasion. Of course, this is concerning because Hezbollah has said that this is their red line for going to war with Israel. So if that red line gets crossed and then the U.S. enters a direct war with Hezbollah and Lebanon, that could easily, well, certainly will make the U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria major targets and would certainly lead to, I think, at least a war with Iran for that reason, just because all the hots in the U.S. every single time a U.S. soldier is injured or killed in the Middle East by one of these militias that do have ties with Iran, they're going to say this happened at direct wars of Iran and we need to go to war directly with Iran. But who knows, at that point, Iran may even enter the war to defend Hezbollah from what the U.S. is doing. And of course, Netanyahu said that Biden made pledges to help continue the war on Gaza. I'm not exactly sure, what Biden said to Netanyahu behind the scenes, and given how he looked in public, it may or may not reflect U.S. policy, but I'm sure that as much time as our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has spent in Israel over the past couple of weeks, whatever the consensus is in the White House has been privately communicated to Israel. And that does seem to be just absolute blanket support for whatever they want to do. All right, I think that covers everything I had on today's show. I will, we will do at least 3 shows again next week. There are a lot of stories here that I've kind of had to put on the side. A lot of my stuff on North Korea I'll be talking about next week. And, we're talking about a 3-front war here on the show today, Connor, but I should mention really quick that the U.S. sent nuclear bombers and landed them in North Korea in South Korea, for the first time in 30 years. And so we'll get into more of the details there. But, as close as we are to this real 3-front war that we're talking about, it's very close. And, as close as we are to war with Iran, given the situation in the Middle East, I don't think we're that much further away from a direct war with North Korea. If you listen to the statements of the North Koreans, not only are they livid with U.S. policy, but it almost reminds me of how Russian diplomats started to sound in 2021, where they really feel like Washington is giving them no choice but war, and that Washington's ultimate end is to go to war with them. And so they have to start taking steps either now to prepare for that war. And even if that means something like Russia, which is almost, kind of preemptively escalating the war by attacking Ukraine, who knows what could happen. But anyways, Connor, let me turn it over to you to start talking here.
Sure. Yeah, it's it's shocking to see. The situation that Biden's administration has gotten us into. Just when you consider the fact that Eli Ratner was brought in to make sure that Lloyd Austin was as much of a China hawk as all these virulent anti-China representatives and senators we have in the legislature are. They brought in Ratner basically to put him on a leash and make sure that they carried out the policy. And Ratner is a guy who was Biden's national security advisor the last 2 years of the Obama administration, and he believed that Trump was weak on China. So we've replaced an administration that had people like Elliot Abrams and Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley with people who thought they were too soft. It's really it's been this slow motion train wreck the whole time, but absolutely, it looks like a 4-front war and just an absolute disaster. But so speaking of the war on Gaza, there is, unfortunately, I think what's not getting paid close enough attention to so far, just because of the mass scale of the scale of the mass murder going on in Gaza and the complete siege and the devastation of all this civilian infrastructure and residential areas, churches, schools, and hospitals, and all these civilian targets being bombed, UN shelters. We're somewhat forgetting that there's also been this massive, campaign of violence waged against the Palestinians in the West Bank, and this had been ongoing all year, as we've been covering
Hey,
quite a
Connor, can I
bit.
just add something real quick?
Yeah.
I don't want anybody to think I'm ducking the Baptist bombing story. The reason I didn't have any updates on it is I really felt like going over everything this morning. Everything I said on the Wednesday show still stands, and I just I don't feel like there's any new video or anything new to confirm our dispute or suggest anything different than I said on the last show. And in fact, I feel a little bit more um, you know, established about what I said, that it was probably, the most accurate analysis I could have given. So anyways, a lot of people are touting that, oh, this was confirmed to be a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket. I don't think that that's still not the case. But go ahead, Connor.
Yeah. I think I'm not saying that that's the case either. I mean, it's the hospital was already targeted with artillery that the Palestinians don't have, and other hospitals have been hit and caught up in these just airstrikes that have been relentlessly pummeling the strip. So, but yeah. So I mean, anyway, it just we haven't been the mainstream media has not been keeping track of the wide scale violence that's been going on in the West Bank, which had already been ongoing. We had known that this was one of the deadliest years for Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, before this month. And so I wanted to cover, because it's about 75 Palestinians have been killed here just since October 7th, just since the Hamas attack on southern Israel and then the launching of the war on Gaza. So this is essentially an update that I wrote up for the Institute on what's been going on in the West Bank since the war started. So this article is amid war on Gaza, scores of Palestinians killed by Israeli forces and settlers in the West Bank. So amid Tel Aviv's massive bombing campaign against the densely populated besieged Gaza Strip, Israeli forces and illegal settlers have been on a rampage of violence, terror, torture, and murder throughout the occupied West Bank. So on October 7th, Hamas, of course, carried out its surprise attack against southern Israel, and the war against the people of Gaza was launched. Now, since then, Israeli gunfire in the West Bank has killed at least, this has gone, the death toll has gone up since I wrote this last night, actually, but this is roughly up to date. So at least 73 Palestinians, including roughly 20 children, have been killed, and over 1,300 people have been wounded. Now, Middle East Eye reported that per Palestinian medical sources, Israel's apartheid army is shooting young Palestinian men largely in the upper body. So we're seeing gunshots primarily to the head, chest, and neck. Many have been shot in the knee as well, with the aim of permanent crippling, as Israeli forces are reportedly continuing their practice of targeting civilians with the banned explosive butterfly bullets, as they're informally known. These rounds pulverize tissue, arteries, and bone after exploding on impact, leaving victims with acute internal injuries. So on Thursday, Israeli occupation forces stormed the Nur Shams refugee camp near the northern city of Tulkarem and clashed with armed Palestinians. Journalist Sami al-Sai from Tulkarem told Middle East Eye, quote, "The attack included raiding a large number of homes, smashing windows and doors, assaulting residents and arresting some of them, and using them as human shields in the face of clashes with the resistance fighters." Al-Saiz also said snipers were deployed on rooftops. There were other witnesses and victims in this attack who said the same thing. Deployed on rooftops were firing at the Palestinians on the ground, fighting large numbers of Israeli army soldiers. Video posted on X, formerly Twitter, by Israel's apartheid army showed by the Israeli military showed a drone firing at Palestinian men at the camp's mosque entrance. So the occupying forces killed at least 7 Palestinians and wounded another 25, although I've seen that number as high as 13 this morning as far as how many people were killed. It was difficult to get a lot of the bodies out of the area because of the damage done to the mosque where people were sheltering. But they're saying 25 were wounded at this time, 17 with live fire, and this was according to the Palestinian Red Crescent. Now, the Israeli forces claim that 10 border police officers were injured, one of them seriously, during their aggression against the camp. It was later reported last night that an IED blast killed one of the occupying soldiers. So settler attacks against Palestinians have drastically increased as well. According to the Applied Research Institute, also known as ARIJ, with the group documenting a 40 percent surge since the war began. So Israel has at the same time locked down the West Bank amid the war in Gaza. So Al Jazeera's Imran Khan, reporting from Ramallah, said on October 11th that the whole place is on lockdown. It's a blockade. It's effectively a blockade, and that's worrying Palestinians because there was a blockade imposed on Gaza. And they're looking at pictures from Gaza right now, he said, wondering if this temporary blockade actually is a precursor to something much more permanent. So the Israeli forces lockdown consists of closing checkpoints, entering new obstructions, as well as fortifying entrances to villages and towns. Under the new status quo, Israeli settlers have been freely attacking people, homes, and businesses. So last week, in the village of Kusra, located near the northern city of Nablus, a Palestinian man was murdered along with his son after settlers and soldiers opened fire on a funeral held for 4 other Palestinians who had just been killed by settlers the previous day. Ibrahim Wadi and his son Ahmad were shot and killed after they confronted soldiers in the street that had blocked the funeral procession with car tires. I also heard that some of the settlers just drove their car into the way of the funeral procession and opened fire. So in the last 2 weeks, there's a report in I believe Middle East Eye that covers that as well. So in the last 2 weeks, nearly 900 Palestinians have been rounded up and detained, with many suffering home invasions, tortures, sexual violence, and beatings at the hands of settlers alongside Israeli occupation forces. And I'll get into it because there's a group called the Desert Frontier Unit, which is recruiting from a extremist settler group called Hilltop Youth. So Amani al-Sahrana, the spokesman for the Palestinian Prisoners Club Association, described the rapid rise in detentions as frightening, citing daily targeting of activists, lawmakers, and former prisoners, as well as their families. She warns that the NGO is having difficulty documenting all the arrests in full detail as they are occurring at a breakneck pace and volume. She said in every arrest raid at a home, Israeli soldiers deliberately destroy furniture and confiscate some of the contents under the pretext of inspection. Al-Sahrana went on to explain that 80% of these detainees have been beaten and abused during arrests, only then to endure inhumane conditions such as being blindfolded and handcuffed over long periods. Now, this was interesting. This was actually reported in Haaretz, and then Middle East Eye did a write-up of it. But 2 employees of the PA, of the Palestinian Authority, were detained last Thursday by Israeli forces in the West Bank village of Wadi al-Sik. They told the Israeli newspaper Haaretz they were held for hours by 20 or 25 settlers and soldiers, stripped to their underwear, taken to an empty building. I believe they were blindfolded as well, beaten on the head with pipes, urinated on, burned with cigarettes, and forced to lay in dirt and excrement. Additionally, their property, including a car and some cash, was stolen. A photo of the 2 badly bruised detainees, Abu Hassan and Mohammed Khaled, along with another Palestinian captive, was uploaded to Facebook before being deleted. A group of Israeli left-wing activists in the area, according to the report, were also held for hours and attacked by the same forces. The Israeli Army's Desert Frontier. This was the Israeli Army's Desert Frontier Unit, which, as I said, has recruited members from an extremist group, settler group called Hilltop Youth. As Israel readies for a ground invasion in Gaza, this is probably old figures now, but roughly 3,785 Palestinians, including more than 1,500 children, have been killed. 12,493 others have been wounded or injured. For well over a week, the coastal enclave, packed with 2.3 million people, half of which are children, has been cut off from food, fuel, water, and electricity. When Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced the order for the complete siege, he said, Israel is fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. So all the worst, all the most virulent hatred all this racist violence and genocidal rhetoric is sort of uncorking this Palestinians were already getting killed left and right by Israeli forces and settlers in the West Bank this year. But it looks like, things have just gotten drastically worse since this war got started. And of course, it's being encouraged by America's unconditional support for Tel Aviv. So protests of the war have also erupted, of course, not just all over the world, actually, but particularly across the West Bank. And in the midst of these, several Palestinians, including teenagers, have also been killed by Israeli forces and settlers during the demonstrations. So prior to the unprecedented air campaign against the civilians locked up in the Gaza concentration camp, I think it's important to note, as I've been saying, but here's some figures. 2023 had already been one of the deadliest years for Palestinians. Before October, more than 220 Palestinians had already been killed by Israeli forces, including over 36 children. This includes 187 people who were murdered in the occupied territories and another 37 in the Gaza Strip, including during a bombing campaign back in May. Moreover, since Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu returned to power in December, backed by his coalition full of extremist settlers and Jewish supremacists, Israel has greatly destabilized the region, including by massacring refugees in Jenin, carrying out drone strikes in Iran, launching myriad airstrikes, nearly 30 at this point, in Syria, and bombing Lebanon. So this was, easily predictable. Of course, one of the motivations for the Hamas attack on southern Israel, of course, that started this was the raids on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which have happened several times throughout this year, both by these rabid settlers and extremist rabbis and supremacist groups, but also by Israeli police and security forces, beating women and children and the elderly and desecrating these holy sites again and again and again. And of course, the murders being carried out virtually every day. I mean, a Palestinian was getting killed every day in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, or in Gaza this whole year. So this is what provoked the attack on Israel. And then, of course, it's been used to justify this massive war, which I do really object to the comparison that it's just like 9/11, because quite frankly, we've already killed well over as many people as died on 9/11. And I don't bring this up often, but my father nearly died on 9/11. He was supposed to be on Flight 175, which flew into the South Tower. And of course, one of the main motivations of the pilot of that flight is Washington's support, unconditional support for Israel, including in their wars against southern Lebanon and their occupations in Palestine. And this kind of, Biden going over to Israel and sitting amongst with Tony Blinken, surrounded by American and Israeli flags, promoting this mass murder campaign, is only going to guarantee that more sons lose their fathers in future attacks on American civilians as a result of this policy. So it's very important, of course, that especially on the right, that people do not fall for this. And thankfully, I think that we're seeing some shifts as polls that have been coming out showing that younger people are not nearly as supportive of Israel as the over 40 demographic. But of course, we'd like to see more progress on that. And it's always important to keep in mind that our support for Israel gets American civilians killed and, obliterates families in situations like 9/11. And of course, we're going to see more attacks on U.S. bases in the region as well. So now I'm going to shift over to Syria. This piece I wrote last week, this is about Turkey's bombing campaign blowing up, I believe at this point, more than half or about half of the oil and power facilities in U.S.-occupied northeastern Syria, where we control that area through our proxy, the SDF, which is dominated by the Kurds and their militia, the YPG. So I wrote this for the Institute on October 12th. So as Turkey bombs U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters, dozens of oil and power facilities damaged in northeastern Syria. Now, Ankara, Washington's NATO ally, has been waging, at this point, it's it's longer than 2 weeks. It's been going on for about 15 days. This bombing campaign against Kurdish armed factions, or at least it started 15 days ago. We'll see if we can update this here soon and talk about it next week. But Turkey's airstrikes have damaged or destroyed more than half of the oil and power facilities east of the Euphrates River in the territory controlled by the U.S. and their Kurdish partners. So Mazlum Abdi, the head of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, blasted the U.S. military for not impeding the attacks during an interview with AFP. He said the United States position has been weak. American forces limited their action to protecting their positions, but did nothing to stop the assault. Abdi said, quote, more than half of oil and electricity facilities were damaged by Turkey's strikes, adding dozens of power plants, gas infrastructure, and other sites have been hit. So residents have been without power at this point when I wrote the article for more than a week. And this is, part of the country where in a region where electricity was already scarce prior to the bombing campaign. Having power or electricity for just 10 hours per day was already difficult to come by. So the SDF, Washington's proxy, and its years-long illegal occupation of roughly a third of Syria is dominated by the Kurdish YPG, which Ankara sees as an offshoot of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK. For decades, the PKK has been waging an insurgency against Turkey and is labeled as a terrorist group by Washington, Ankara, and the European Union. So after a recent suicide bombing for which the PKK took credit targeting the Turkish Interior Ministry, Ankara launched its bombardment of Kurdish armed groups in Syria and in northern Iraq as well. So Turkey insists the suicide bombers entered the country by way of Syria, although the SDF denies that claim. And they've stated that they've stated that 44 people, including security forces and civilians, have been killed since the onslaught began. Turkey claims those numbers are actually much higher. The U.S. has deployed roughly 900 troops to northeast Syria, where they're controlling most of the war-torn country's oil and wheat resources as an extension of Washington's economic war against Damascus. Additionally, thousands of Turkish troops are occupying areas in northern Syria. In order to cut off their funding sources, Ankara has, quote, directly targeted infrastructure, services, and resources used by the Kurdish groups to prevent the SDF from carrying on, as Abdi said. He says forces present in the region, be they Russia, American, or the international coalition, must keep these attacks from happening, he implored. So since 2020, following the establishment of a security corridor, Turkish and Russian forces have conducted joint patrols in the region along the Kurdish-held areas bordering Turkey. These clashes between a U.S. treaty ally and Washington's partner force come as Arab tribesmen living in U.S.-occupied territory have been revolting against Kurdish rule. Some analysts have argued the ethnic tensions boiling over into a guerrilla war could render American forces' uninvited presence no longer tenable. Before Turkey began its latest round of airstrikes, those clashes between the tribesmen and the SDF saw more than 100 people killed and thousands of families displaced, according to the UN. So Washington maintains that its unwanted presence in Syria is aimed at ensuring the lasting defeat of the Islamic State. However, ISIS took over large swaths of eastern Syria and western Iraq directly as a result of a failed regime change operation under the Barack Obama administration. The dirty war saw the CIA, Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other U.S. allies arming and funding rebel groups, including al-Qaeda affiliates. The U.S. side ultimately failed in its attempt to overthrow the Syrian government, but the war killed hundreds of thousands of people and of course, devastated the country, which is going to take hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild. But, the Biden administration's economic war against Damascus is designed to prevent reconstruction in the country until Assad is no longer in power. That's what Blinken declared, I believe, in summer of 2021, and nothing's changed since then. We target the construction and engineering sectors to prevent them from getting their country back on its feet. So at any rate, the terrorist group has been all but eliminated by Damascus with its Russian and Iranian allies. And of course, if Washington would get out of the way, likely a deal would be made with the Kurds that would resolve a lot of these issues with Turkey. And you would probably see the remaining pockets of the Islamic State wiped out. But the U.S., for a number of reasons, including the fact that Israel insists we stay in Syria, indefinitely occupying about, like we said, a third of the country, will not leave. In the meantime, they're sitting ducks for Shiite militias who resent U.S. policy in the region, but particularly this butchering of thousands of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. But we'll get to that in a moment. This next story was written by Dave DeCamp on October 15th. Israel bombed Syria's Aleppo airport for the second time within 3 days. So Dave writes, Israeli airstrikes hit Syria's Aleppo airport for the second time within 3 days, again knocking it out of service amid Israel's bombardment of Gaza. So this was last Saturday. Sana News agency, Syria's Sana News Agency spoke to a military source that told them, quote, at about 11:35 p.m. on Saturday, October 14th, 2023, the Israeli enemy carried out an aerial attack from the direction of the Mediterranean Sea west of Latakia, targeting Aleppo International Airport, which led to material damage to the airport being put out of service. This new act of aggression affirms the criminal approach of the Israeli occupation entity, which is clearly embodied today in its continued crimes against the Palestinian people and the massacres it commits against innocent civilians, including women and children. So on Thursday, Israeli airstrikes targeted the Aleppo airport and the Damascus airport, putting them out of service. According to this was last Thursday. And so, according to the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the Aleppo airport was struck again on Saturday, just a few hours after it had resumed service after the attack by Israel days earlier. So the Saturday airstrikes mark at least the 27th time Israel has bombed Syria this year. Sources told the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights that Israel's purpose of targeting Syria's airports amid its Gaza onslaught is a warning to prevent Iranian military flights into the country. The sources added that, quote, the two targeted airports had not witnessed any arrival of the military shipments of the Iranian militias, and that the Israeli targets came only to put the two airports out of service. Israel frames its bombing campaign as airstrikes against Iran and Hezbollah's presence in the country, but as we've covered countlessly, these attacks frequently are killing Syrians and damaging civilian infrastructure, as we see right here. So, quote, the Syrian Observatory said in a statement, we condemn the Israeli attacks on public and private institutions which belong only to the Syrian people, and stress that the military presence of Iranian forces and their proxy militias in Syria must never be used as an excuse to violate Syria's sovereignty, which is a pretty strong statement from a group that supports the opposition against Assad. So over the past year, Syria's airports have become a common target of Israeli airstrikes. According to the Syrian Observatory, since August of 2022, Israel bombed the Aleppo and Damascus airports 10 times. Just unbelievable. So this next piece is from Dave. Again, U.S. bases being targeted by these Shiite militias with drones. We have some minor injuries reported. This piece was written yesterday. So Dave writes, a U.S. base in Syria came under drone attack on Thursday, causing some minor injuries. U.S. officials have told the Associated Press. The officials said that the attack targeted the Al-Tanf garrison in southern Syria and that 2 drones were involved. One drone was shot down and the other caused the injuries. Lebanon's Al Mayadeen TV also reported a separate drone attack on a U.S. base at the Conoco gas fields, which is located in Syria's eastern Deir ez-Zor province. The Europe-based Deir ez-Zor 24 media outlet also reported an attack on Conoco, saying these drones 3 drones targeted the base. And then Dave just reiterates that 900 troops are in Syria. U.S. troops are in Syria, taking the a third of the country where the oil and gas fields are. And so the attacks on U.S. bases in Syria come a day after drones were launched at U.S. bases in Iraq, also causing minor injuries. A little-known Shia militia, Tashkil al-Waratin, took credit for one of the drone attacks in Iraq. The attack on U.S. bases in the region might increase as the U.S. is strongly backing Israel's onslaught on Gaza. If the Gaza war escalates into a full-blown conflict involving Hezbollah, and the U.S. directly intervenes, U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria would likely come under significant attack. And, of course, Israel's bombings, which happened before the war started, were happening on a weekly basis. But in the context of the current onslaught on Gaza, of course, I think that the more Israel pummels Syria with these bombs, it increases the chances that we're going to see mortar fire or responses from Shiite militias against toward Israel or toward the occupied Golan Heights, or further attacks on these U.S. bases. And it's not impossible that that's part of a strategy to pull the U.S. into the war from the Israeli side, but it certainly would be the results would be absolutely devastating for everybody involved. And this is just getting. This is really getting out of hand. I believe we have 2,500 troops in Iraq, at least 900, although there's reason to believe that number is higher. Certainly, I mean, there's probably at least hundreds of contractors based in Syria as well, with the, alongside the U.S. forces and the SDF. And there's just all these tripwires with Russia in the country, of course, and Turkey as well, occupying territory in the north. This is a great opportunity for, what remains of ISIS to begin launching attacks and perhaps framing the Shiite militias. And we know that the CENTCOM and the Biden administration and all the hawks, as Kyle mentioned earlier, are going to just go with the story, no matter what evidence contradicts it, that, well, this was Iran, this was a Shiite militia, this is an Iranian cat's paw. They're killing Americans. The Ayatollah is ordering it. We need to go to war with Iran. In fact, I saw a campaign commercial by Nikki Haley. I'm not sure. I didn't get the, I approve this message kind of thing at the end. However, they're promoting her as vote for Nikki. She will go to war with Iran. It's pretty wild. And I did see in the wake of this bombing campaign on Gaza that at least on Fox Business, I saw Neil Cavuto reporting that Nikki Haley's numbers have gone up with Republican voters, like support for her, because they think she has, relative to the other candidates besides Trump, has the foreign policy experience necessary to handle situations like this. And of course, as you were talking about earlier, the brinksmanship with Russia, and then as we're getting closer and closer to war with China, which men like John Aquilino have already said they want to. It's a hot war; they're going to fight directly. So, just a perfect storm. And illustrating that further, the U.S. says it has intercepted missiles and drones fired from Yemen from Houthi forces, excuse me, potentially headed toward Israel. So this was Dave DeCamp wrote this yesterday for antiwar.com. The Pentagon said on Thursday that a U.S. warship in the Red Sea intercepted missiles and drones that were fired by Houthi forces in Yemen. The crew of the guided missile destroyer USS Carney, operating in the northern Red Sea earlier today, shot down 3 land attack cruise missiles and several drones that were launched by Houthi forces in Yemen. And this comes from Pentagon spokesman Brigadier General Pat Ryder. He said, quote, "There were no casualties to U.S. forces and none that we know of to any civilians on the ground." Ryder said it was unclear what the missile and drones were targeting, but said that they were headed north in the Red Sea, quote, potentially toward targets in Israel. So the Houthis have already warned that they could fire missiles if the U.S. directly intervenes in Israel's war on Gaza. This incident is the latest sign that the war on Gaza could escalate into that regional conflict. As U.S. bases in Syria and Iraq are also coming under fire at the same time. The U.S. has been backing a Saudi-led coalition against the Houthis in Yemen since 2015 in a brutal war that has killed at least 377,000 people. And I believe 70% of those victims are babies and children under 5 years old. From the Houthi perspective, they have been at war with the U.S. as the Houthi media describes the coalition's forces as U.S.-Saudi aggression. A ceasefire between the Saudis and the Houthis has held relatively well since April of 2022, but no lasting peace deal has been signed. And of course, the U.S. bylined the genocidal campaign against the Houthis, but the people of northern Yemen, of course, where 70% of the civilian population lives. They put the country under a full blockade, which was backed by the U.S. Navy, and then, of course, providing intelligence, logistics support, selling the Saudis weapons and helping pick targets, and even refueling their warplanes that were just bombing civilian targets left and right, waterworks, sewage systems, farms, marketplaces, schools, hospitals, just absolutely brutal, not dissimilar to the situation we have in Gaza, just in terms of how it's interpreted in the region. I mean, this is why the Houthis are ready to go and defend the Palestinians, especially against U.S. and Israeli forces. I mean, we are just turning such a, this whole region is we're just, once again, just like after 9/11 and the period before 9/11, stirring up so much anti-American hatred that I fear that there's going to be massive blowback coming down the line, and likely sooner rather than later. But the internal politics in the U.S. just demand that we continue down the path we're already on, at least amongst the establishment, because the Israel lobby has so much power. What is encouraging, and this next story is from Dave DeCamp, he wrote this for October 18th, is that Jewish groups are leading massive protests against the war on Gaza and U.S. support for it, and are demanding a ceasefire. So Dave wrote this piece, Jewish groups lead Capitol protests calling for Gaza ceasefire. So on Wednesday, a group of protesters calling for a ceasefire in Gaza entered the Cannon House office building, a congressional office just across the street from the U.S. Capitol. So the demonstration was organized by 2 Jewish groups, Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. Protesters inside the Cannon House wore shirts that said "Not in our name" and "Jews say ceasefire now." Jewish Voice for Peace wrote on X that, quote, "While 500 Jews, rabbis, and descendants of Holocaust survivors chant 'Let Gaza live' and get arrested inside, a crowd of 10,000 sings outside. We won't stop until our demands of a ceasefire are met." The number of people who attended the protest is not confirmed, but reports say that at least 100 demonstrators were arrested by the Capitol Police. The U.S. Capitol Police put out a statement on X saying demonstrations are not allowed inside congressional buildings. We warned the protesters to stop demonstrating, and when they did not comply, we began arresting them. Actually, during this protest, a right-wing Kyle, do you remember that congressman's name that stood over them and held an Israeli flag on the second floor above
No,
their
I don't.
protest? Okay, but it was a pretty wild sight to behold. Not it could have been predicted, but still, just incredibly embarrassing to see the quality of people representing the American populace here. That they would take the side of this apartheid state murdering women and children over Jews who are saying, we said never again, we meant never again. And so the protest comes on the same day as Biden visited Israel and met with Netanyahu to pledge full U.S. support for the Israeli onslaught against Gaza. Since the October 7th attack, Dave says here that over 3,000 Palestinians have been killed amid the relentless bombardment. So, okay, so this next piece is interesting because there's a piece out in the Huffington Post that came out yesterday that says that there is a mutiny brewing in Blinken's State Department, that there's quite a bit of internal division, that a dissent cable is being prepared because there are just masses within Foggy Bottom who feel that Blinken and his senior advisors just refuse to listen to their grievances about this campaign against the Palestinians, which they see as completely wrongheaded and inhumane and completely antithetical to American interests. And they oppose. I'm sure we'll hopefully we find out more details, but this is a very important moment here, and we've already seen resignations, and that's what this story is about. That Dave wrote yesterday. State Department official resigns over Biden's support for Israel's Gaza war. So an official with the State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs announced his resignation on Wednesday due to President Biden's full-throated support for Israel's onslaught in Gaza that came after the October 7th attack, the Hamas attack on southern Israel. So Josh Paul said in a statement on his LinkedIn account that he had worked for the Bureau of Political Military Affairs for 11 years. He strongly condemned the Hamas attack on Israel, describing it as a monstrosity of monstrosities, but said that Israel's response will only make things worse. He said, I believe to the core of my soul that the response Israel is taking, and with it, the American support both for that response and for the status quo of the occupation, will only lead to more and deeper suffering for both the Israeli and the Palestinian people. And it is not in the long-term American interest. The administration's response, as much of Congress's as well, is an impulsive reaction built on confirmation bias, political convenience, intellectual bankruptcy, and bureaucratic inertia. That is to say, it is immensely disappointing and entirely unsurprising. Here. So Paul continued to criticize the history of American blind support for Israel, as he characterized it. Decades of the same approach have shown that security for peace leads to neither security nor to peace. The fact is, blind support for one side is destructive in the long term to the interests of the people on both sides. I fear we are repeating the same mistakes we have made these past decades, and I decline to be a part of it for any longer. So discussing his time at the Political Military Bureau, Paul is a bit all over the map. Said he made moral compromises, but that he had reached his limit. Quote, in my 11 years, I have made more moral compromises than I can recall, each heavily, but each with my promise to myself in mind and intact. I am leaving today because I believe that in our current course, with regards to the continued, indeed expanded and expedited provision of lethal arms to Israel, I have reached the end of that bargain. According to the State Department's website, the Political Military Bureau is the department's, quote, principal link to the Pentagon and provides policy direction in the areas of international security, security assistance, military operations, defense strategy and plans, and defense trade. Paul said he was proud of the work he had done at the Bureau, including on pending administration decisions to transfer lethal weapons to countries that abuse human rights, and his involvement in the policy of fueling the Ukraine war. So at least we have dissent on one of these wars. And and quite frankly, I hope that this is the beginning of many more resignations, and that we do really see Blinken come under heavy pressure here from his own, his own bureaucrats, because essentially, Blinken, from what I understand from this piece, what they're frustrated with is they're not being listened to by him, and all he cares about or has any, all he's spending all of his energy focusing on Israel's military operations against Gaza. And of course, Blinken is a ardent Zionist. I believe he said before that I inherited my Zionism. He has a history of Zionism in his family, and he is, this is a guy who's bylined the war in Iraq, helped whip the Senate when it held a majority, and Biden was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Helped essentially sabotage the Senate hearings on the war, precluding real experts like Scott Ritter and others from getting in there to tell the real story that could have stopped the war. He's bylined and helped engineer the wars in Libya, Syria, Yemen, of course, the proxy war in Ukraine, and all of the worst aggressions under this Biden administration, be that against North Korea or China or, and of course, Iran. I mean, the Biden policy on Iran has been much more hawkish than Trump, even, as Trita Parsi has pointed out repeatedly. I mean, they have been almost cultivating this climate where Israel feels like they have a free hand. They can attack Iran. They can start a war. They can drag the United States in. And that was what Trita was warning about this whole time, was that the Biden administration, unlike previous administrations, gave them this green light, saying, if you attack Iran and you start this war, excuse me, sorry about that, we will support you and be behind you every step of the way. And of course, before this war started, the U.S. and Israel was going to carry out another massive round of military drills. They carried out their largest ever yet in the beginning of the year. But they were going to carry out drills practicing bombing together Iranian nuclear facilities. And of course, Lindsey Graham has said he's saying we need to bomb oil refineries and cut off all the money that Iran has. But he's saying he wants joint bombings, air campaigns of the U.S. and Israeli warplanes attacking Iran, which would just, that could, certainly kick off this massive regional war and potentially World War III. You've got so many different tripwires there, as we said earlier, but especially with Russia. But it's, this is just unbelievable. And I'm glad to see that we have at least some people in the State Department who, whether or not they care much about the fact that we're on the brink of nuclear war, more so than ever with Russia, and as a result of this policy in Ukraine, at least they're standing against this genocidal campaign being waged by the likes of Netanyahu, Biden, and Blinken. And I hope that Blinken has hell to pay coming down the road.
Well, Connor, that all sounds good. Although Victoria Nuland is number 2 at the State Department, so
she's the final boss they have to deal with. Blinken seems like it might be easier to deal with.
Well, my concern would be is that, Blinken ends up getting booted and she ends up getting another promotion. And then we end up with a true neocon in the head of the State Department. But we'll hope that won't happen. And Connor, thanks so much for the update on today's show. And everybody will be back with more next week.
Thank you, Kyle.